This series of slides is going to talk you through the four-step process of creating in-text citations. So the in-text citation is the part of the citation that goes in the text. So what that means is it's the signal phrase and the parenthetical reference that goes along with the borrowed material that you got from your outside source. So the first step is to make yourself an end text citation. So let's say you found a piece of an article that you want to include in your essay. The first thing you're going to do is make your end text citation, which is that citation that goes on the works cited page. Sometimes people call that sources, bibliography, but that's all the same thing. In MLA, we call it works cited, and it goes at the end of the essay, and your first step in incorporating sources would be to make the end text citation. So here's an example of an end text citation. You can see that it's got the author's last name, first name, and then the rest of the elements that are required in MLA. The second step in incorporating a source is to identify the source material that you want to include in the essay. So in this instance, it's a piece of an interview from an article that the author wanted to put into the essay. The third step is to make this thing called a signal phrase, and a signal phrase is something that you write yourself, and it establishes the context and the credibility for that piece of the borrowed source. So the signal phrase's job is to explain to the reader why this outside source is good, so that's the credibility, and context, where did you get it from? So here's the signal phrase for that piece of borrowed material in Archie Volume 4, so that's the context. The credibility piece comes from explaining why that particular person has good insight on that particular piece of information. So this is an essay about Archie comics, specifically about Betty and Veronica. So using a comic writer from Archie Comics makes good sense because they have good credibility on the topic. So we've made our end text citation, we've made our signal phrase, and we have our borrowed material. You'll see that one of the easiest and quickest ways to make your signal phrase is to grab that first bit of information in the end text citation and use it in the signal phrase. So that's what the author's done here. Then the last step is to make the parenthetical reference. So the parenthetical reference is the page or paragraph number that corresponds with where that piece of borrowed material came. So when you look at these two things together, you can see that the signal phrase, because it has the author's last name, it's really easy to match it up with that end text citation because you can go by the author's last name. So if somebody was interested and they wanted to follow up on that source material, they would be able to look in the works cited, find that author, and then use that page number as a reference. So let's do another sample. Remember, step one is to make the end text citation. So this is from the same essay, looking at stuff about Betty and Veronica. And so the end text citation, in other words, the citation that goes on the works cited page, is from someone named Nicole Drum. It's from a website. And we have the title. So the next thing to do would be to identify what they call the source material or borrowed material. It's just any stuff that you want to put in your essay that you got from somewhere else. So we call that source material. So you're going to identify that material that you want to put in the essay. And here it's a quote. And then the next step is to make the signal phrase. So again, the signal phrase needs to establish context, where did the material come from, and credibility, why is it any good? In 2019, after CW's Riverdale began airing, Betty and Veronica comic writer Jamie Rotan tells Nicole Drum, and then we move on. So the signal phrase contextualizes, in other words, kind of explains where that outside material came from. That's the context. And then the credibility is why it's valuable, why it's good. So here we have another comic writer. In this case, it's someone named Jamie Rotan. So we're saying that Jamie Rotan is credible because she writes for the comics. And then here the contextualizing is actually contextualizing the quote from saying like when it happened. And also that it was inside an interview with someone named Nicole Drum. So there's a lot going on there. Signal phrases are complicated, but they add a lot to the essay because they incorporate the source in a way that isn't just dumping it in there and then, putting a parenthetical reference. So again, here we have the end text citation. You can see that the author used that first piece of information in the end text citation, Nicole Drum, the author's name, used that up in the signal phrase, and then built from there. The last step is always to add that parenthetical reference. So what it tells you is that on page 3 of that piece from Nicole Drum, or paragraph 3, depending, this is probably paragraph because it's from a website. So you can match that up, and a person would be able to use those references to locate the material themselves. But the signal phrase does more than just simply say where the stuff came from. It, again, establishes the context and the credibility. So it does a lot more than just simply match up your source material. It enhances the essay because it explains to the reader where the information came from and why it's important and why it's credible. Here's another sample. So our first step is always to make that end text citation. After you've made the end text citation, you identify the material that you'd like to include in the essay. And here it's another quote. Then we're going to make the signal phrase. Remember, the signal phrase needs to establish context and credibility. Context, where did it come from? Credibility, why is it good? So here you can see it does both of those things. It explains that the quote came from an interview, but it also explains that the quote came from the showrunner, the person who actually created the show. So you'll notice the end text citation isn't the piece that this author used for the signal phrase. This time they wanted to emphasize that the quote came from the showrunner, because the showrunner is the person who has the most credibility in this case. So it makes sense to reference the showrunner in the signal phrase. So the parenthetical reference is going to look a little different. So you can see that in this case, the author's last name, because it's not in the signal phrase, it's in the parenthetical reference. So in this way, you've got two things going on here. Number one is that the parenthetical and the signal phrase together establish all of that context and credibility. Where did the information come from and why is it any good? And in this case, when we put when we put the author's name in the parenthetical reference, we can still match the source material to the in-text citation.